دوستان عزیز درود بر شما و میریم سراغ Cultural Heritage. جنگ رستم و اسفندیار رو مشاهده میکنید و این یکی از داستانهایی بوده که با عنوان Cultural Heritage ما ایرانی ها بوده. Heritage یعنی میراث، Cultural هم اون فرهنگی و اینا میشه. اما بریم سراغ این. گفته استرالیا and New Zealand have many common links. استرالیا و نیوزلند خیلی لینک های مشترکی دارن. Both countries were recently settled by Europeans. میگه اروپایی ها اونجا ساکن شدن تو هر دوتا کشور. Are predominantly English speaking. میگه بیشترش زبان انگلیسی صحبت میکنند. And in that sense و از اون طرف share a common cultural heritage. این اولی رو میزنیم و میگه یه شیر میکنن یه cultural heritage که براتون توضیح دادم، همون میراث فرهنگی که هر جفتشون دارن، استرالیا نیوزلند. Also in close proximity to one another. اگرچه اینا خیلی نزدیک هم هستند. Both countries are geographically isolated. اما از جغرافیایی اینا آیسولیت شدن، یعنی کلا اطرافشون آیسولیت شدن دیگه، یعنی مجزا هستن. I have a small population by word. و جمعیت بسیار کمی دارن با word. این خیلی مهمه. word standards. تا همین میبینم word standard خیلی معروفه. همون استانداردهای جهانی هستش. word standard رو باید بلد باشین. word standard تکرار کنید بعد من. They have similar histories. اونا تاریخ‌های مشابهی دارن و and enjoy close relations on many fronts. و لذت میبرند از روابط نزدیکشون در بسیاری از جهات. حالا اینو براتون دکتر ادم از دانشگاه سیدنی توضیح میده. In terms of population در رابطه با جمعیت جای خالی، استرالیا و نیوزلند have much in common. خیلی مشترکات زیاد دارن. حالا میره سراغ قسمت بعدی. Population characteristics یعنی ویژگی های جمعیتی. الان داره میره سراغ دموگرافی که مفهومش میدونین جمعیت شناسی میشه. Both countries have minority indigenous populations. جمعیت های indigenous یعنی افراد بومی بسیار کمی دارن. من که تو نیوزلند بودم فکر میکنم 10%شون افراد بومی بودن، یعنی همین بهشون هم میگفتن ماوری. And during the latter half of the 20th century و در قسمت نصفه دوم قرن بیستم have seen a steady stream of migrants. مهاجران migrants میشه. stream یعنی جریان، steady هم یعنی یک نواخت. From a variety of regions از مناطق مختلفی throughout the world تو مناطق مختلف جهان. خودتون میتونید معنیش بکنید. Both countries have جای خالی similar declines in fertility. توی باروری declines هم یعنی کاهش مشابه داشتن هر دو کشور. have باید ببینیم چی. این countries وقتی میگه نکنید کشورها میتونن experience کنن، یعنی میتونن ببینن. countries یعنی توی الان اینجا have seen هم بود درست میشد. این یادتون باشه تو متون زیاد میاد. Both countries have experience. Both countries can have seen for example. این یادتون باشه، یعنی experience راحت میتونم بگم، میتونیم بگیم یا میتونم ببینم. حالا من گذشتهش آوردم مثلا. این یادتون باشه این دو تا فعل زیاد میاد. خب during the baby boom یعنی وقتی که بچه همه داشتن میزایدن این دو تا کشور decline داشتن. And alongside this have enjoyed the benefits of continually improving life expectancy. و لذت بردن از مزایای افزایش بهبود life expectancy یعنی افزایش عمر، که تو ایران نمیدونم چنده. حالا نوشته 83 و خورده ای سال توی استرالیا هستش. کشور مثلا آمریکا 80 ساله. ببخشید توی یونایتد کینگدم 80 و خورده ایه، تو آمریکا هم 77 ساله. خب one consequence of these trends، یکی از نکنید consequence عواقب میشه ولی نتیجه یه کاری هم میشه. یکی از این نتایج این ترندا تو هر دو تا کشور این بود که اینا، ولی عواقب معمولا نتایج منفی رو میگن consequence، are faced with، مواجه شدن با aging population یعنی جمعیت پیر and جای خالی challenge of providing appropriate care و فراهم کردن شرایط مراقبتی. care یعنی مثلا چه میدونم یکی سنش بالاه باید الان یه نفر پرستار بگیره واسش، به اون میگن care and support for this growing group within the community و ساپورت کردن این جمعیت، این گروهی که یعنی گروه افراد پیر رو داره میگه که دارن هی افزایش پیدا میکنن توی این کامیونیتی. خب اینجا میشه چی؟ ببینیم چطوری میشه گفت. هیچ کدوم نمیشه. ویتنس میشه شاهد، لیمیتیشن لیمیت میشه حد، لیمیتیشن هم یعنی محدودیت، هیستوری تاریخ، ترادیشن، شرد. اینجا میشه associated challenge یعنی چالنج های مرتبط با این. پس این یادتون باشه. میریم حالا سراغ عدم. خوب گوش کنید.
So the difference between tradition and heritage here is a bit subtle. A tradition implies a continuous process. Heritage only implies that you've got some influence in the past. So either one can work grammatically, but choosing heritage is slightly better here because Australia and New Zealand have had a process of disrupting those European traditions as well as continuing them. It's not purely that one tradition that's being carried through and it's totally common, but there is a common heritage that is a past influence that isn't a tradition. So it's a very subtle difference. I would say tradition could almost work here. It might have a more conservative connotation. That is, you're asserting that there is a tradition that needs to be upheld rather than observing that there is a heritage, that is a number of things that have been inherited. That, you don't have to take up your heritage. You can ignore it, in fact, if you want. The reason why we don't use values here is because values would be about, it wouldn't fit grammatically. Because if you were talking about cultural values, it would be that plural. You couldn't say they share a common cultural value, singular. That would mean something different. That is whether or not they're seen as valuable rather than what things that they value.
And what would values?
Yeah, so sharing a common cultural, it would have to be share common cultural values. That would also be a slightly different sort of assertion because you'd be saying that not only do they have history in common or influences in common, but they also believe some of the same things as Europeans, and also English-speaking peoples. And I think you could make that argument, but that's not quite what they're trying to say here because they're talking about the past, the influence of the past. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And also tradition is too strong. It implies too much continuity, whereas heritage is a bit weaker. It implies influence, but not total continuity.
Exactly.
Okay, so the reason why standards rather than characteristics here is that when it's a comparative. They're comparing population sizes, and when you're comparing something, you compare it to a standard. To compare it to the characteristics, to world characteristics, would be a bit strange. You could say you could say that the population size is uncharacteristic. That might be a way of using that word, to say it's uncharacteristic population size, but to have small populations by world standards works better, because a standard is like a measure or a criterion that you're using.
World standard is a common term, yeah? We can use it a lot.
It's used. You're implying that there are kind of global patterns or averages that are the basis of comparison. The word itself, standard, for me is not ideal here either, because it implies that someone has decided on a standard that they're enforcing or that people want to adhere to. But I actually think this is much more about average sizes. It's much more about, what we might think of as statistical norms, rather than a determined sort of, this is what we think the standard should be. So yeah, standard for me is not an ideal word, but that phrase, by world standards, to indicate a comparison to what things are like all around the world, that is a very common phrase. Yeah. Okay, so they have similar histories and enjoy close relations on many fronts. The choice between close relations and close relationship is actually grammatical here more than anything. You'd say, and enjoy a close relationship. But then when you add on many fronts, you're wondering, how can you have one relationship on many fronts? So you could say they enjoy a close relationship, full stop, or you could say they enjoy close relations, implying several such areas on many fronts, means in lots of different ways, in several different ways. So you could possibly say enjoy close relationships, plural, on many fronts, and that would probably be about the same, to be honest. The on many fronts part of it is, we're imagining that it's like a spatial metaphor for, there are lots of different things, places that we share in common. We have these places in common, many fronts, different ways that we face. When we look in this direction, we have things in common over there. When we look in this direction, we have things in common over there. The front as a frontier or a boundary. So we're connected on many different, in many different directions, I guess. It's a weird metaphor. Obviously, we don't literally have any shared boundaries except in the ocean, because they're both island countries. And then in terms of population characteristics, this is a shift of focus. We've moved from, in the beginning of the paragraph, we're talking about heritage and history. Now we're talking about demographics. So we've changed slightly the set of terms that are appropriate for talking about demographics. Now we're talking about the population as something that can be measured. In terms of population characteristics, Australia and New Zealand have much in common. It only becomes clear as the next sentences develop, because then the sentence after this, both countries have minority indigenous populations. So we're talking about numbers. And during the latter half of the 20th century have seen a steady stream of migrants. So the numbers and composition of the population characteristics fits better there. You could potentially say that they, in terms of population heritage, they have a lot in common too. If you were referring to the backgrounds of much of the population, many people in Australia and New Zealand have British heritage. A smaller but still significant number have other European heritage. A growing number have East Asian heritage. Yeah, again, they start talking about fertility in the final,
yeah.
or in the second last sentence.
Yeah.
So both countries have experienced similar declines in fertility. So they don't share this decline because they're not um, they're not one population sharing that decline, but they can be seen as experiencing something similar. So they don't share similar, they experience similar characteristics,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, you're right. So I think it's partly about what it's possible to share, and you can't really share multiple declines. So the fact that it's plural declines suggests that there've been two separate demographic declines that they can't be shared.
So
Similar failings, that is, that their personal characteristics are similar and they both share a propensity to procrastinate, or share a disinterest or a disinterest um, in studying. Yeah, so
so
I want to say that for two people to share something, that thing has to be either singular or not really counted. So characteristics, um, mm, no, you could, yeah, I think characteristics, when we talk about characteristics, it's like you're not dividing up into distinct categories. But if we're talking about a demographic decline or a fertility decline, those are two separate measures. So they can't quite be shared. They can be seen as similar, or they can be experienced in similar ways. It's a very, like, you'd probably get away with saying both have shared similar declines in fertility. That probably is something that most readers wouldn't notice.
Mhm.
They would
But
accept that. They would say, "Oh, that sounds a bit strange, but I don't know why." Um,
but experience similar declines or something like that is correct. Experience. Mm.
yeah, so countries can experience things, countries can see things. So it's often like a country has experienced something, and what it means is the population of that country has been part of that process. It's a very strange usage if you think about it too much.
So countries can see something or experience something great. And can you also explain about this part?
Um,
History challenge is incorrect, but can you explain about this one?
okay, so this is all about what happens in the first part of the sentence. Um, One consequence of these trends is that both countries are faced with an aging population. So the first part of the sentence is saying they both have an aging population. Their population in general is getting older. Um, and the associated challenge, it has to be connected to that first point, of providing appropriate care and support for this growing group, because the focus of the second part of the sentence is on that population and that group that is increasing. There are more and more older people who need care. So it's an associated challenge.